Thanks a lot for coming this morning. As you know, I've been fascinated by the move of Web 2.0 technology into government. I'm delighted to have as our guest this morning Beth Noveck, who is the Deputy CTO of the United States and the Director of the Federal Open Government Initiative. So please welcome Beth Noveck. Beth is also a native New Yorker. All right. So, is it like the West Wing?
It moves a lot faster, I fear. But just like that.
And the hours are a lot longer.
Hours are a lot longer. The ceilings are lower. The rooms and offices are smaller. And not nearly so many love affairs, I'm afraid.
So, you started out thinking a lot about government. You actually wrote a book, Wiki Government. You did one of the most successful, crowdsourcing projects in the public sector with peer-to-patent. And then you went to the White House to try to put all your ideas into practice. Talk to us a little bit about what it's really like taking those ideas and trying to make it happen in government the way it actually is.
Yeah, well, it's both an honor and a challenge. But we're very lucky because we have a president who is 150% committed to the concept of bringing innovation to government and to using technology to do so, to really trying to bring change to the way that Washington works and frankly to the way that government works to have it be more accountable, more effective, and more efficient. So I wouldn't be able to do the job that I have if we didn't have a president who were so squarely back of this. But it allowed us to come in on the first day, and I have to add, it was the very first thing that the president did after his inauguration was to sign the executive memorandum on transparency and open government, and to call for creating a government that is, as he put it, more transparent, more participatory, and more collaborative. Now,
so based
from
on
there, though, there's a lot of work to do.
That's right, yeah. Based on that vision, sound like, boy, we're going to have this amazing revolution, and yet, we see a lot of things going on. Looks kind of like business as usual. What's your biggest success so far, would you say?
So let me tell you a little bit about I think what's going well, and we should talk a little about what the challenges are in addition. So I think fundamentally what's incredibly exciting is to watch this culture shift taking place, where we start out with a vision for greater transparency and openness, and we see that not as something that's coming out of just one office, my office in the White House, or even from a pronouncement from the president, but something that's spreading all across the government, such that in every meeting I go to, first of all, it's amazing to me where in these meetings people are talking about and feel the need to engage with the topic of how are we being transparent, how are we being open about the way that we work, how are we actually engaging with people. Even when it's hard to do and it takes some time to bring these things about in reality, everybody engages with the question of how do we do our work in more open ways. So I think fundamentally the most exciting success is the fact that we're talking about it, that everybody's grappling with it and trying to figure out how to do it. The challenge is, of course, doing it in practice and making sure we have the tools available to us to do so.
Right. So a lot of your focus has, in fact, been building some of the tools for open participatory policy making. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that's been working and what level of participation you've had, how useful it's been? Have you actually had results that were shaped by that dialogue, or is it really just like people commenting on a blog and you kind of go on doing what you know best?
So it's really a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
We have the nation's first chief technology officer. We have the nation's first chief information officer. We have a general services administration, all of whom are working on, as well as agencies across the government, on making sure that we have tools and platforms available to do a lot of this work. But I wouldn't underestimate that it's just a blog or just a wiki. It is a fundamentally huge shift to sit down and say, we're not actually going to finish baking a policy and maybe then throw it up for some public comment and ask people what they think when it's already finished. But we're going to start at the outset and say, what should our health IT standards be so that we can create more effective electronic healthcare records? What should our open government policy be? Not when it's finished and done and we already have a finished directive, but that we're actually getting out there and asking people, what should that policy look like? How do we actually make it work better? So what we're seeing a lot of is use of existing tools and platforms, particularly low-cost or free tools and platforms that are available now to actually do social engagement, to ask people to get their ideas. Just last week, we had a meeting that we called for any agency that was interested in brainstorming and coming up with new ideas for how to make the agency work better, to essentially do some internal R&D, say how can we be more effective and accountable internally. No one was forced to come. It was entirely word of mouth, the invitation. We had 30 agencies turn up for this first meeting to actually, of people who were either already doing work, doing brainstorming and using brainstorming platforms, or agencies who were about to and wanted to get on board to say, we'd actually like to try some of these same techniques that the private sector has used for generating good ideas to improve the way companies work, to improve the way that government agencies work.
So has this changed in any fundamental way that the kinds of people who you're learning from? You know, for example, the government has long had federal advisory committees, but it's generally some small body of experts, usually fairly senior people in companies or academia, who are handpicked by the agency that is looking for advice. And so in some sense the advice is directed by the people who are making the policy already, versus in your open initiatives, it's really anybody can show up who cares. Have you found, what have you found? Has it been, you've got some people that you just had no idea about who've come in, say on health IT standards, and said, here's this project we're doing, here's what we've learned, and it's completely changed your thinking? Or, or on the other extreme, have you had, hecklers or people who are not useful, who are banging their own drum or trying to what's the range of experience and how useful has it been?
So I think that's exactly the point. There are let me say a couple of things here. First, government employees. So to pick up on the last idea about internal innovation and how we generate ideas, whether it's the SAVE Award for how to save money in government or the Green Gov Award to come up with ideas for how to green this enormous organization that employs so many millions of people, we're tapping first government employees and government officials who have really not been asked before how to make their organizations work better. A lesson that every company has since learned and is learning about how you don't just make decisions from a central boardroom, but you involve people who are the line workers, who are at the front of an organization, at the edge, who have some of the best ideas about how to make it work better. It's why the VA, for example, is running this challenge with its 19,000 employees in the Veterans Benefits Administration to come up with ideas for how to reduce the backlog on veterans benefits claims.
So have they come up with any good answers
So
yet?
that competition is running, and they're coming up with good ideas, and there's a commitment to invest in what those ideas are. But the second place is also, in addition to government employees, is tapping the citizenry, what the president often refers to as the expertise and intelligence of the American people, trying to get outside of Washington, and particularly using new technology to do so. And we have to do that in two ways. So first is through policy. Number one is closing the revolving door on lobbyists coming into government, including by kicking them off, as we have done, federal advisory committees and commissions that are providing advice to government. So
you guys need to understand, this is big.
This is a
Clap.
big deal.
I mean, if you can, because there is this sort of closed loop of policy being set by self-interested parties that is a big part of what you're trying to break.
Lobbyists have every right to come and petition government and to come and make demands, but they should not be making policy from the inside.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that everybody has access to the ability to advise government and to provide those ideas and expertise. So first and foremost is to make sure we're creating the space to do so by ensuring that lobbyists are not serving on federal advisory committees, and by making very transparent who is. But the third thing is we only have a way of actually getting more people to serve, hearing their voices, hearing from the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare professionals when we talk about health IT, for example, if we use new tools to tap the expertise of people who live outside of Washington, who live in New York.
No, I know. I like that.
California.
Looking at the health IT dialogue, you see, I am a physician practicing in this way, and this is my experience. That's a very different kind of voice than the typical voice that you'll see in one of these, committees. Somebody sort of speaking on behalf of their industry, supposedly, and it's very, this is feels much more authentic and close to the ground.
But let me also add that it's not just people who have a voice in terms of commenting, whether it's written comments on a rule or it's policy comments on a blog or through some other electronic technique. It's also people who are getting involved in new ways by doing things like writing code, making websites, and participating according to their highest and best use, which may be technical rather than just legal or textual or typing or involving sharing policy ideas. I mean, plenty of technical people also want to type comments on rulemakings, but what we're trying to also emphasize is new forms and opportunities for engagement to allow people to participate also in and give back in new ways.
Well, so that relates a little bit to the project that Neil Dash announced yesterday, which is actually a continuation of something you started before you actually went on the inside, right? So his expert labs is a sort of continuation. What was it called originally?
Oh, at one point we called it the Policy Innovation Network. It's had a number of, you may know it under another number of different names, but I think Expert Labs really is kind of a great name. The work that I've always described my own work as being about creating do tanks or tech tanks rather than just think tanks. Yeah,
again, for background on a lot of how Washington works, there's this huge network of think tanks that write policy papers to advise, government on here's how you ought to think about the issue. Often, they're quasi-academic, but there's this new concept that I think you're really trying to pioneer of saying, hey, if this is technology involved, let's actually build a demonstration project.
Well, to your earlier point, it makes no sense in many ways in this day and age of networks and social networks to have the one way that we generally advise government being a standing committee of 20 people who provide advice over several years. Or frankly, also going out to a think tank, commissioning a paper for a very large fee that may take 2 or 3 years to write. We need that research to be done as well. But sometimes a question comes up in the course of our jobs, and I have to say, particularly in the White House, we're confronted with a range of issues. We can be working on healthcare at 9 o'clock, and on 10 o'clock we're working on transportation policy, and at 11 o'clock we have to deal with the economy or with a war. We need expertise faster and better from the people who know. And that means we have to take advantage of social media to be able to do so. So the idea of creating an expert labs, as the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has done, or organizations setting up things like Google Summer of Code or other instantiations of efforts to get technical expertise available to government, to get scientific expertise, to just connect people's brains with the really tough questions that we're facing so that we can get better answers faster. Because sometimes what you need to know is not a research report for 3 years. I need to know the names of the top 4 people who may work on human-computer interaction, who can provide us advice about how we can better design an interface to make a website more accessible, for example.
So one of the questions, we had put up questions on Twitter, and I think you and I were backstage going over which ones we thought were the favorites, and I think your favorite was the question, even though it didn't get the top number of votes, was posted by someone who identified themselves as Imagine Election, and it was just, is transparency boring? I mean, how do you get people to care? Because lots of government data is dull. How do you surface the important parts? When you mention something like that, human-computer interaction, that's a great example where there's a lot of people in this audience who would say, "Oh, I'd love to take a look at that." But if you put out some kind of jargon-filled, government program, their eyes roll back in their head and they don't go, "Oh, that could be me." How do you translate?
So I think this is my favorite because, of course, I spend my whole day working on data transparency, so to me, it's actually the most interesting and exciting thing in the world. But I'm a little geeky that way. So I think first of all, not everybody has to care about raw data feeds. But when we make government data available in machine-readable formats, when we make it available for download, what we do is we make it accessible to people in this room who are going to build the applications on top of that data to translate into things that are exciting and meaningful for a vastly larger number of people. So first of all, if you're a journalist and what you traditionally do is work as a government watchdog, providing accountability, criticizing government, the more data we put out about how recovery dollars are being spent, or how a project is being done in government and what it costs and what money is being spent, the greater accountability we can actually provide. And that's very exciting for a lot of people and extraordinarily important for our system of democracy. But when we also put out data that may be, for example, I'll just give you an example that just came across my desk this week. This is not a federal example, it's a state one. Massachusetts just launched its own raw data catalog and started putting out raw transportation data. It means that someone can turn around, as they did on Saturday, and in 1 hour make a software application that allows you to see whether the T in Boston, what time the next T is coming, and whether it's on time or not. So if I'm a rider of the T in Boston, I may not care at all about raw government data, but I do awfully care whether my morning commute is going to be delayed.
So that's kind of an interesting case that has to do with not so much formal policy, but expectations. You know, there was a problem here in New York with the MTA originally trying to shut down the Station Stops app, iPhone app, which did something similar before they got religion and said, no, it's really okay. You know, this part of what we're looking for is the good example that lets some local government agencies say, oh yeah, if you do this, you get that. And it's spreading that idea, you know, so there are a couple of cities have done that, and some other cities says, oh yeah, we could do that too. What are the key, is there sort of a list of best practices that you're working on? Now again, some of this, obviously you're at the White House and this is a local government initiative, but how do we get the ideas to spread, or is it just natural diffusion?
Well, I think that it's, you know, all politics are local, of course, and in many of the ways that people are going to engage will be at the state, at the local, or at the federal level. So I think there's a real kind of ecosystem of transparency and engagement that's emerging that we can help. When, you know, President Obama makes a statement about transparency and open government, and then the CIO of the state of New York turns around and says, we're going to be inspired by that and let ourselves pursue some of the same policies, or whether in turn we're inspired by a state that has an open government law and open government practices before. I mean, this is all kind of part of an ecosystem, but we can't just let it, diffuse by itself. We have to take very active steps with policies that promote the release of raw data in machine-readable formats. We have to put out an open government directive that's going to require every government agency in the federal government to come up with its own open government plan. And that means developing strategies for being more transparent, releasing data, prioritizing data that's of the highest value, and doing so explicitly with citizen engagement. And so by moving towards a culture where, again, it's not out of one office or one bully pulpit that we're making a pronouncement, but having everybody work on this question, that we create these opportunities.
Kind of a difference between the public sector and the private sector that concerns me somewhat, and where I think we might need a bit more of an intervention. In the private sector, an entrepreneur in some remote place comes up with a great idea, and it can spread everywhere. But take your transit arrival times application idea. It's a great idea, and yet it looks like it has to be reinvented in every single city. Now along comes a group that says, wait, no, let's create Open 311. This is not for transportation. This is, you know, about 311 services. You know, they've stood, hey, let's create a standard. So we can have one app that wins, that runs everywhere. I can be from Boston. I can be from San Francisco. And I can, you know, I use my 311 app at home. And now I'm visiting Washington, D.C. I can use my 311 app. Is there a role for coordination? You know, so this is the standard API that cities will use to publish transportation data. This is the standard API they'll use to take, you know, 311 information. how do we get that kind of leadership? How do we get cities, say, to work together, states to work together?
Technological federalism
That's right.
at its best. So, of course, you start out with the notion, as Justice Brandeis said, of states as the laboratories of democracy, right? So we have to start out with a lot of
great quote.
playful experimentation of the first 2 or 3 or 4 people who come along and say, wow, I can make a transit app based on this data. Or who come up with the idea in the first place. For example, we made the Federal Register, which is what I like to think of as the newspaper of our democracy. It's the everyday catalog of what happens in the executive branch of government. So along come the first initial applications that get developed for making that data more searchable, making it searchable geographically, commenting on it for the first time. But once we do that, someone may come along and say, I have a better way of doing commenting on it, and then there may be a third. But at some point, we're going to start to push towards a standard of going, this is the best way to do this. That's where, for example, the federal government can play a role in helping to create data platforms, helping to that involve sharing data across all levels of government, creating, curating, and showcasing examples of best practices. So we've created something on the White House website called the Innovation Gallery. And that's where we showcase some of these best practices, starting now at the federal level, but we'll be moving into trying to showcase some of the things that are going on at the state and local level as well.
Okay, so you're going to use your bully pulpit.
To use the spotlight, if you will, to shine the light on that. But along comes the National Association of State CIOs and says, we need to do more of this kind of code sharing so that when one state builds an application and potentially spends a lot of money on building an application, we're sharing those applications across states. When we sat down with our 30 agencies a couple of weeks ago, and we've actually met more than once now, to talk about brainstorming in agencies, that was explicitly with the purpose of saying we're going to share code by figuring out which agency has the best kind of brainstorming program for employees. We don't need 30 different brainstorming platforms. What we need is potentially 1 or 2 or 3 best practice brainstorming platforms, and everybody obviously to apply it in their context.
Again, going back to the private sector versus public sector, in the private sector, somebody wins in the marketplace just because users vote with their feet. When it comes to, let's say, 20 different agencies have their favorite approach to a problem, how is one of them going to win? If there's the pet project, likely with a contractor behind it who gets locked in with a budget. How do you get some of those dynamics? I mean, are you going to, by fiat, say, okay, we have decided, we've looked across the 30 agencies, and this is the platform we're going to standardize on? Do you hand that down? Do you get together as a group and decide that? How does lobbying change that? Because again, on a lot of these projects, the economics are very different. Somebody has put out a procurement. It seems to me that there's a lot of different obstacles there.
You are right that there are a lot of obstacles, but we push towards far greater transparency around the way we spend money in government and the way we do contracting in government. And let me tell you that Vivek Kundra and the CIO's office and the community of federal CIOs are aggressively and actively working towards greater transparency, not only about and across the $76 billion of IT spending in government, but more generally about the way that we spend money in government so that we can see where there's waste, fraud, and abuse, where there are these ridiculously bloated contracts that are over time, over budget, and wasteful, where if we can surface and elevate the examples of where we're spending millions of dollars on something that could be done for cheap, what we have to be able to do is to see those instances taking place first.
What about this whole idea? I know there's the cloud computing initiative. As we have this move to the cloud,
right.
And there's sort of an opportunity to have these applications really in and off the shelf.
Service, infrastructure as a service provided through apps.gov has been stood up. Apps.gov, the website, has been created to do this so that instead of just a paper catalog where I can look through and see, where can I order my pens and pencils and paper clips in government, I have a visual searchable catalog. I have that coupled also with a special part of that site that's dedicated to free applications, which is growing very quickly. and that I can also link that then to best practices so that people can see, if I want to do brainstorming in an agency, I shouldn't be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a brainstorm or to do an online dialogue when I have this whole series of software applications available to me for free. It's also we're creating these kinds of communities of practice around things like citizen engagement, around things like transparency, collaboration, et cetera, are extraordinarily important.
So a practical question for this audience. Let's say that somebody out here has an application that they think, hey, this would be useful for the government market, but I have no idea how to sell to the government. I'm not really interested in moving to DC, getting a DC office, figuring out how to get on it.
Right.
Is there a way for somebody who has a fantastic app that could be useful in, it's a new social media app, for example, or it's a, clever way to, take citizen input, not just about a particular problem, but, the equivalent of, if we had a C-click fix for the stimulus, for example, how would they get that, into the data.gov catalog? One of the things I love about, the DC, apps.dc.gov, the local, and they have here are the government apps, and here are the apps that have been generated by the public, and they've got the two columns. Is there any hope of just having a general catalog of things that might be useful that can be used without procurement?
Yes.
A
couple of suggestions here. One is this website, apps.gov.
Yeah.
Incredibly useful because it has also instructions for how do I actually list my software application that I want to provide. So I have the cool new social media tool, and I want people to know about it and how to use it. You can go to apps.gov and actually have your tool listed and be subject to government-friendly terms of service, in other words, protective of user privacy and having certain requirements about disabilities access, et cetera, which will then make it possible for any agency that wants to use the tool to do so. But the second thing that I really recommend to people is what a lot of people have potentially in this audience is a better way of using an existing tool or a project that they want to see done. So they may know a cool, citizen engagement tool, but what they want to see is using it in a context to make people's lives better by doing engagement around healthcare or environment or education. Or they see something in the news and they say, I think of a better way that I can solve this problem and that I can do this. And the trick there is not only to present the tool through apps.gov, but to put together one page which says, I have a better idea for how to solve this problem. And now with every agency moving towards creating its own open government plan, creating towards a vehicle for openness and engagement. I was going to say, send it to me, but now you'll be able to send it to wherever the agency is or the issue is where you have an interest, and to actually provision that app, suggestion for how to solve the problem better.
I'm still a real newbie in Washington, but when I hear that, what I see is
you want to keep it that way.
Somebody sends in a great idea. And there's a couple of pathways. One, nobody's paying attention. The other, somebody's paying attention, and it's a contractor who then kind of goes and knows all the ropes, and they end up getting a procurement issued for them to get paid a lot of money to implement that idea. How do we, keep that from happening?
So let's be clear, though, at the outset that there is a role. There are plenty of people in this audience who are selling software to government and want to do so. We're not looking to undercut people who are providing jobs and making a living by selling IT product support and services. So there's nothing.
No, I understand. I guess I'm talking about, there's things that we know. I remember having a conversation with Anish. This is actually when he was still in Virginia. Rather than when he was in his federal role. And he said, it's so frustrating, if I had something I wanted done. I asked a friend. It was done in an hour. I know that if I put it through procurement, it will be a year-long process and it'll cost, $1 million. And, so even if somebody submits an idea, how do we actually get the loop? Because it might be somebody in this audience who could actually implement that idea rather than getting it implemented through the traditional government procurement process.
I don't want to undercut the importance of procurement reform at its root and greater transparency and simplification how the procurement process works. That's why the president also appointed a new chief performance officer who's going to focus on these issues. Came into Washington just this summer to begin focusing on the question of how we do procurement reform. But when we do radical transparency, when we make the data available, and we say, okay, here's the Federal Register in downloadable format. Or better yet, we say, here is patent data in downloadable format. I don't know if I see Carl sitting there in the front. It's a little dark back here, but I think I do.
Carl Malamud you're referring to.
Yes.
Carl is one of the heroes of the open government movement. He's been at it since 1993, before anybody else even thought it was important.
So when we, as Carl would say, when we liberate the data,
public.resource.org.
Then, again, it's instead of worrying about, what he can do is to turn around and either make that, as he's done, work on making a better version, a more accessible, readable version of the Federal Register, or taking Patent Office data and making it actually searchable and usable by people in a way the Patent Office can't do for itself at the moment because its IT systems are so antiquated, and can work with other groups on doing so, on crawling that Patent Office database and ensuring that entrepreneurs and inventors who want to have access to patent data so that they can figure out, is my invention really new or not new, and build new businesses around that patent information, can do so quickly and easily, and can do so in a relatively short amount of time, because by making the data freely available and putting it out there, we leave it to Carl to do what's best with it. We leave it to Anil Dash and the folks who are going to be volunteering for Expert Labs to build the social media apps on top of it, to create that value out of it. And then what we can do is turn around and say, gee, this seems to be a much better way of presenting the Federal Register, or this is a really cool application for transportation, and we may want to bring that back into the government to put it up on a website, to showcase it or to use it and make it accessible to vastly more people, because we may have the bigger megaphone or the bigger set of eyeballs that we can attract by putting it on a government website. So it's really this collaborative process that I think that's extraordinarily important to creating innovation in the ecosystem. It's not by trying to do everything out of government itself, and not by trying to do everything using very, very long and slow procurement processes, which have their value in terms of bringing transparency sometimes to very big IT contracting projects, but are not the right vehicle for the 99-cent iPhone app that we can build in an hour.
So I want to come back to a couple of the questions from Twitter. Now, one of them was from Chris Boucher. He asked about the limits on executive privilege. He said, what do you believe are the appropriate limits of executive privilege in the disclosure of information to Congress and the public? I mean, this is the era of transparency. Somebody else asked me on Twitter, is the president exempt from the Open Gov directive? How do you decide what's public, what's private? What are the limits?
So transparency is not always an easy question, and it's not easy to go towards full transparency overnight for a number of reasons. First, there are cost and resource issues. So as we start to think about what data do we not collect that we should be collecting? What data are we collecting that's sitting in paper format in a shoebox somewhere and needs to be digitized? What data do we have that's digital but not available where anybody can find it, like registered on data.gov? We simply have issues about which things to do first and which things to do second. So we have to prioritize information and data that's of the highest value to people and where they most need that information. In other words, what's the toxic release inventory in every category that's really going to be the game-changing data that we need to provide? The second thing is we have to be very careful about personally identifiable information. So and this is another really historic move, for the first time ever in history, the White House is now making available the information about the 100,000 people who visit the White House every month. So it is totally historic that instead of having backroom dealings and meetings in the White House, now everybody who comes and goes from the White House, those visitor
Isn't that a little bit
logs,
security by obscurity? I mean, we don't really care about the visitors who are kind of just getting the tour. We care about the visitors who are there for meetings.
Right, but we also care, let me say, that when you come for your tour, I don't know if you've had a tour, Tim, but
No,
I
I
owe
have
you
not.
one if you do come, is that we want to make sure that we're not releasing your Social Security number with that information that you came to the White House. So we have to be very careful about personally identifiable information. And the third category, of course, is national security information. It is not, however, information that is simply embarrassing or that we have not typically released before, but it still takes some time to find the information, to get people used to the fact that we're going to make it available.
But I also assume you have a lot of pushback. I would bet that you go in there and you say there's some White House lawyer who says, we can't release that. Same thing as in any company there, you know, I mean.
Actually, the White House lawyers are our best friends in this regard. We have a wonderful White House counsel named Norm Eisen, whose sole focus really is on government reform, government transparency, and government openness, and he is a relentless crusader for making things more open. It doesn't make it easy for people to do, either because there are difficult considerations like national security and privacy that we do have to take very seriously, or because it's a cultural shift and it takes some time to get used to, and we do need to proceed gradually towards the goal of being more open in the way that we work. The other thing that, go ahead.
Let me just jump in because we're just about out of time, and I have one last question I'd really like to ask. We have this strong push on transparency and open government from the White House, a lot of the executive office agencies. We have a lot of activity at the state and local level. What about Congress? I mean, that is actually where the laws get made, where a lot of the backroom dealings are going on. What do we need to do to open up Congress?
Well, I have the, thanks to the separation of powers, I can only speak for the executive branch, for the White House,
but
for the president's.
Speaking as
an academic.
As a former academic, yeah.
For once and future academic, I'd like to think that what we're engaged in first and foremost is a race to the top. In other words, when we start to create a culture that where transparency and civic engagement become the norm. And I know that a lot of people have said things like, oh, data.gov, it doesn't have that much data on it yet. It's boring. It's not that exciting yet. But what we're doing is beginning to create a culture where this is the norm. I think it becomes very, very difficult to stay out of that ecosystem. It becomes much harder to justify when everyone else is engaged in doing civic engagement and transparency, in doing town halls, in being open and provisioning data. It's going to be harder for people to resist, and that concludes whether it's Congress or the courts or state and local government. I'd like to think that it's going to be a race to the top towards creating a culture and a new ecosystem that's much more transparent. And particularly, again, you know, you see a lot of this, a lot of the groundswell coming from the state and local level of people really trying new and exciting things. I want to get in my one mention.
Okay,
Do we have time for this?
Well, sure. Just throw it up, and then we got to go.
Yeah, you and I both talked about this. Our new favorite example of the week. I don't know if we can get up our Manor
Labs.
Manor Labs. We're going to get it in here. I've never been to
tiny town in Texas.
Population 5,800 just came across my radar screen this week. Some of you may have seen this example of how Manor Labs, Texas, population 5,800, is crowdsourcing better ideas for how to run the town, whether it's dog catching or tax collection in the town, and awarding points to citizens who come up with the best ideas that then get implemented. And with your points, you can then buy yourself mayor for the day, ride along with the police chief, or a T-shirt.
It's kind of like open government meets Farmville. It's really quite cool.
I now want to go to Manor, Texas. But when I see things like that, it's incredibly exciting and heartening to me. About where we can go and where anybody can go and play a role. The person who sent this to me is both judge and CIO of Manor, Texas. He probably wears a few other hats as well. And that means there's a role for everybody to play to get involved, whether it's making software, commenting on a rule, making an iPhone app, creating the next generation of IT tools that allow us to do civic engagement and to do these new practices in better ways. I think we're just at the beginning of a real culture shift.
All right. Well, with that, I think we've got to wrap. Thank you very, very much, Beth, and good luck to you, and keep fighting the good fight.